Everywhere you look in my background, you'll find people who despise America and want to transform it radically. Americans often wonder, why am I so comfortable with anti-American extremists? And why are they so comfortable with me? People also wonder why I polarize America at home.
Average income of the top 1%, the breathtaking greed of a few,
And apologize abroad.
There have been times where America's shown arrogance.
Well, you'll understand as I tell you about the dreams from my real father. My real father was communist Frank Marshall Davis. He was a card-carrying member of Communist Party USA, card number 47544. He was a Marxist and staunch supporter of Uncle Joe, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. I am what's known as a red diaper baby, the child of a Communist Party USA member. My real father was a communist organizer in Chicago and Hawaii, as well as a talented writer and poet.
Frank Marshall Davis, writer.
The FBI had Frank Marshall Davis under surveillance for 19 years, compiling a 600-page FBI file. I have my mom's long chin, but many features are from my real father. My eyes, brow, nose, and lips. My smile, my body and stature, and my build. We're both 6'2", and my deep voice.
Joined together many times to counteract what is going on and the attitudes of whites.
We both smoke. Like my real father, as I get older, age spots are showing up. I look more like him every day. Even if you find this hard to believe, you'll see that Frank Marshall Davis was my ideological father, beginning with my formative teenage years. He taught me the doctrines of Karl Marx, embedding me with the ideology of class struggle that he said would one day bring a dictatorship of the proletariat to America. By the time I was 18, Frank Marshall Davis's worldview became mine. And my mission in life was to fulfill his dreams.
My father was a foreign student, born and raised in a small village in Kenya. He grew up herding goats. My father grew up herding goats in Kenya.
I know. I sold myself to America as the multicultural ideal.
With a father from Kenya, a mother from Kansas, and a story.
Typical white folks from Kansas moved to Hawaii, where my mother married an African student, a loving family separated only by the Kenyan's desire for a Harvard education. But the rock upon which I built my political career was only a fairy tale. To get elected, I systematically misled the American people.
My father was from Kenya, from Africa.
In order to obscure my true political foundations. I don't fancy myself a liar, but the dreams from my real father, changing America by replacing capitalism with socialism, far outweigh any obligation to tell the truth.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
Look, my election was not a sudden political phenomenon. It was the culmination of an American socialist movement that my real father, Frank Marshall Davis, nurtured in Chicago and Hawaii, and has been quietly infiltrating the U.S. economy, universities, and media for decades.
We are the ones we've been waiting for.
This is the story I would have told if I were being honest with you. Now, let me introduce you to my real father, Communist Frank Marshall Davis, and his dreams. Three years after the Bolshevik Revolution, the American Communist Party was founded in Chicago by journalist John Reed. For the next 60 years, CPUSA received funding and orders from Moscow, which it implemented without question. In 1930s Chicago, CPUSA targeted journalists for recruitment because of their ability to spread Soviet influence in American public opinion. My real father, Frank Marshall Davis, was one of them. A graduate of Kansas State Journalism School, he joined the Communist Party and began writing for the Chicago Star. During his 20 years in Chicago, my father wrote for all the communist publications and was deeply involved in an astounding number of communist front organizations. Frank Marshall Davis was assigned by CPUSA to recruit blacks into the movement. My father authored 3 major volumes of poetry.
I was known as a realist. I wrote about whatever I felt, hitting as hard as I could.
Many poems were political, which often contained proletarian messages. He believed all poetry was propaganda.
Take it then from the careless fists of the money drunk. Place it in the reaching hands of the little people.
As a Marxist, many of his poems were anti-religious.
Your tales about Jesus of Nazareth are no go with me. Grace is a Dixie nigger.
My father was an avid photographer. While in Chicago, he started a camera club.
The Lens Camera Club. I have to have been president of it.
He specialized in nude photography. My father also wrote columns on jazz and was a DJ for a jazz radio station.
I was involved with the Abraham Lincoln School. This was a progressive school.
Chicago's Abraham Lincoln School was a communist-run training school. My father was on the board of directors. He helped write the Marxist curriculum and lectured on American imperialism, colonialism, and jazz. He met his wife at the school, a white socialite, 18 years his junior, who was also a CPUSA member. By World War II, Communist Party USA had grown to thousands of members, all loyal Soviet patriots. Some became spies. and stole America's plans for atomic weapons, helping to ignite the Cold War.
Well, you know, I had an FBI agent who had been my personal agent.
The FBI began tracking my father in 1944. He was placed on Security Index A, meaning he would be immediately arrested in the event of war with the Soviet Union. U.S. naval forces in Hawaii were an obstacle to Soviet expansion in Asia. So in 1948, the Kremlin ordered CPUSA to facilitate a U.S. withdrawal from the islands. CPUSA assigned Frank Marshall Davis to Honolulu, where he began writing for the communist newspaper, the Honolulu Record. In his frankly speaking columns, he flawlessly mirrored official Soviet propaganda. He blamed American capitalism for starting World War II, denounced the Marshall Plan, and demonized President Truman as a fascist colonialist warmonger itching to launch World War III. He preached government health care, wealth redistribution, nationalization of industry, and bashed Wall Street. Anyone opposing socialism was KKK, a white supremacist.
Crisis in Honolulu, caught like the rest of Hawaii in the paralyzing grip of a dockman's strike.
I met all of the ILWU top brass.
My father helped organize the communist-controlled International Longshore and Warehouse Union. In 1949, they mounted a strike aimed at taking control of the island. It eventually failed after 177 days. As in Chicago, Frank Marshall Davis was given the task of recruiting blacks for the Communist Party. Comrade Frank Marshall Davis suddenly appeared on the scene to propagandize the membership with the purpose of converting it into a front for the Stalinist line, complained Edward Berman of the Honolulu NAACP. The National NAACP revoked the Hawaiian chapter's charter to prevent a communist takeover.
The Eastland Committee, I was under subpoena then to testify.
In 1956, my father was subpoenaed by the Senate Subcommittee on Un-American Activities. When asked about his Communist Party membership, he pleaded the Fifth.
That would indicate that I had been a member of the Communist Party, and I have never told anybody that.
My grandfather was Stanley Dunham. I called him Gramps. He enlisted in the U.S. Army during World War II, and my mother, Stanley Ann, was born while he was away. She was named after him in case he didn't survive the war. Thankfully, he did. In fact, he enjoyed European culture and set his heart on working abroad one day. Gramps was told he needed 1 year of foreign language to qualify for a government job overseas. So he moved the family to Berkeley and studied French. I know, I've told the tale that my grandfather was an extremely restless furniture salesman, traveling the country to find just the right furniture store. That was a cover story. Gramps was a company man, a spook, CIA. After Berkeley, Gramps signed on to Air Force Intelligence, working at Shepherd, then McConnell Air Force Base, before landing a job with the Central Intelligence Agency. In 1953, Gramps was posted to Lebanon as a CIA case officer at the U.S. Embassy in Beirut. That's where Mom got her first taste of living in third world countries. And she loved it. Though the family was Methodist, Mom enrolled in Catholic school in Beirut, Collège Notre-Dame de Jamhur, a boys' school which had a co-ed program for foreign students. As the Red Scare deepened in the 50s, Boeing Corporation in Seattle began producing the B-52 Stratofortress, a long-range strategic bomber designed to drop nuclear bombs on Russia.
If colonists are working in our national defense industries for the purpose of sabotaging our preparedness program,
it was critical to U.S. security that the B-52 design plans not fall into the hands of Soviet agents. However, Seattle was home to many CPUSA members. The chairman of Mercer Island School Board, John Stenhouse, admitted to being a communist. Stenhouse taught at Mercer High School in Seattle and was president of the Universalist Unitarian Church. It was so full of commies, they called it the Little Red Church on the Hill. The CIA conducted domestic surveillance on American communists as part of its work aimed at foreign powers. In the fall of 1956, Gramps was assigned to Seattle to monitor CPUSA. The family joined the Unitarian Church and Mom entered Mercer High School. She was Gramps' cover story. As a teenager, Mom hung out at Seattle coffee shops, listened to jazz, and read beat poetry. Mom was often in conflict with Gramps. She found him oppressive and overbearing. Once, she drove to San Francisco with a friend on the spur of the moment just to shock Gramps, who had to fly to fetch her back.
The contest we're engaged in with the communists is a contest for the minds and hearts of people around the world.
In the late 50s, Russia and the United States were competing for influence in emerging African nations. The Russians opened People's Friendship University. In response, the CIA began Operation Airlift Africa to educate African students in the United States. In the summer of 1959, Gramps began commuting from Seattle to Hawaii every 2 weeks for the CIA as Mom began her senior year. Gramps' job was to oversee the African students and recruit them as future CIA contacts. Arriving in Honolulu from Kenya in August of 1959 was Barack Hussein Obama. That's how he pronounced his name, Barack. He was welcomed at Hickam Air Force Base by none other than my grandfather in a traditional Hawaiian ceremony. Barack Obama's arrival was covered in a local newspaper, where he complained of the unexpected high cost of living. Over the next 9 months, Gramps blended in as a furniture salesman, joined the Unitarian Church, and struck up casual conversations with local communists, including my real father, Frank Marshall Davis. When Mom graduated high school in June of 1960, she was planning on attending the University of Washington in Seattle, along with her large group of teenage friends. She was devastated when Gramps announced the move to Hawaii. He tore her away from her teenage world to an island thousands of miles out in the Pacific Ocean. Hawaii was like a different planet for a kid from Seattle. Mom enrolled at the University of Hawaii taking only 2 classes in protest. She was miserable and alone, and even worse, an outsider. Whites were just 1/4 of the population. Mom was desperate for friends and seeking revenge for what Gramps had done to her. An interesting black man had visited Gramps at their apartment. He seemed cool. He was a poet and knew all about jazz music. Mom began skipping class, sneaking over to Frank Marshall Davis's house to hang out.
Your lips, sweeter than old wine. Your eyes, more beautiful than April rainbows. I do not love you for just your body.
He read her poetry. He played jazz records for her and showed her his nude photo collection. At some point, she agreed to pose. These photos were taken a few weeks before Christmas 1960, when Mom was about 5 weeks pregnant with me. There's no mistaking, this is my mom. The long denim chin, the petite mouth, the arched eyebrows, the earlobes, the thin upturned nose. Frank then sold the photos to men's mail-order catalogs. Now, sometimes Frank had Mom pose with other women. Here, Mom is sitting on the same couch as Frank in this 1948 interview. Mom's recent tan line is visible. And she's wearing Chicago-style high heels belonging to Frank's wife. My father's jazz records are clearly in view. Stan Kenton's Cuban Fire and Nat King Cole's Love is the Thing. My father was also a swinger.
I have a collection of intimate portraits called Horizontal Cameos.
He later wrote an autobiographical sex novel under a pseudonym describing years of sordid sexual encounters, often involving group sex. In Sex Rebel Black, I think he memorialized the encounters with my mom. Anne came up many times the next several weeks. She obtained a course in practical sex from experienced and considerate practitioners. I think we did her a favor, although the pleasure was mutual. I'm not one to go in for Lolitas. Usually I'd rather not bet a babe under 20. But there are exceptions. I didn't want to disappoint the trusting child. Frank Marshall Davis often wrote poems about his conquests. A few weeks later, just after New Year's 1961, Mom realized she was pregnant. When she told Gramps, he yelled until she revealed who the father was, which made him yell louder. Mom screamed back, "It's your fault for dragging me to an island where I don't have any friends." Gramps knew it was because of his job that Frank Marshall Davis had entered their home. He sunk into a haze of guilt as he assessed the situation. The age of consent in Hawaii was just 14, so no crime had occurred. However, abortion was illegal and dangerous. He would not turn recklessness into a crime, nor risk his daughter's health, and would have to live with the stigma of an illegitimate black child. But then, Gramps realized he was in even bigger trouble. Frank Marshall Davis was under FBI surveillance. If they found out the #1 communist on the island was his new son-in-law. He would lose his security clearance and his job at the CIA. Then he really would have to sell furniture. Gramps decided to meet Frank Marshall Davis at a bar in Waikiki. Frank said he was sorry, but he was married with 5 kids and didn't want his wife to know. He suggested they find a substitute father to marry Mom. A black man. That would legitimize the birth. Gramps liked the idea, and he knew just the guy, an African student under his supervision, who needed money. Barack Hussein Obama. The next day, Gramps invited the Kenyan to the same bar and brought up the sham marriage. Barack said no. He was already married with children in Kenya. Then Gramps explained, if you marry an American citizen, you can get a work permit and extend your visa to study for a PhD. Barack recognized the opportunity and agreed under 2 conditions. Number 1, that the marriage take place away from Honolulu to hide it from his classmates. And number 2, that he bear no responsibility for the child. Gramps agreed the birth certificate would state father unknown, and the deal was done. Now, Gramps had to get Mom on board. She agreed on the condition that Gramps let her enroll at the University of Washington in Seattle, which, she yelled, is all I wanted in the first place. Gramps had no choice, and Mom had won her rebellion. A few days after the semester ended, Mom and Barack Obama flew to Maui for a civil wedding. A few days later, Mom mailed in her University of Washington application. And on March 3rd, Barack Obama applied for a work permit and extension of his visa. Over the next 6 months, Mom took maternity classes at Kapiolani Hospital and arranged for an apartment in Seattle's Capitol Hill area. On August 4th, 1961, a midwife was called to the house. A few days later, Gramps phoned in my birth to the Hawaii Department of Health, as was the norm for home births. He told them my name was Barack Hussein Obama and added the second instead of Junior, which would have meant son of. As agreed, he declared the father unknown. A few weeks later, Mom began classes in Seattle. A year later, Barack Obama was off to Harvard for his PhD. By the spring of 1963, Mom had had enough of her rebellion and returned to Hawaii. Gramps' plan had worked well. Mom had a legitimate child. Barack Obama was long gone. Frank had kept the secret from his wife. And Gramps had kept his job at the CIA. A few months later, according to plan, Mom was granted an uncontested divorce.
And this East-West Center is doing a lot of research on so many interesting things.
Next, Mom re-enrolled at the University of Hawaii at the CIA-funded East-West Center, where Gramps was busy recruiting foreign students. Mom fell in love with an Indonesian man, Lolo Sitoro, in her Russian class. Gramps had recommended she study Russian as a path to employment at the company. Mom married Lolo, and in 1967, we joined him in Jakarta. We had a live-in maid. Lolo had pre-registered me for school under his name and religion, Islam. I attended Muslim school and studied Quran for 2 years. I said the Shahada, the Muslim call to prayer, every day. According to Islamic law, this meant I was a Muslim. In December of '71, Mom returned me to Hawaii to begin my American education at Punahou, an exclusive first-class prep school. Gramps obtained an affirmative action scholarship for me as a black student. However, a problem emerged. With a white mother and father unknown on my birth certificate, the school required the appearance of Barack Obama to secure the scholarship. So Gramps tracked down Barack at a government office in Nairobi. "Remember me?" he asked. Barack didn't want to bother. Said he'd done his part of the deal 10 years ago. So Gramps offered the Kenyan his own apartment and money to spend. A month-long Hawaiian vacation. All he had to do was show up at the school with the ID and keep up the ruse for young Barry. Recently divorced, my real father moved to Waikiki, where Gramps took me to spend time with Uncle Frank, as I was told to call him. Uncle Frank was affectionate toward me. He read me poetry, and we bonded. Often, as he and Gramps drank whiskey, I felt I was witnessing some complicated, unspoken transaction between the two men. Soon enough, at age 12, I learned the truth. I was poking through some boxes at Gramps' place when I found my birth certificate. Why was the father unknown? I demanded to know. Gramps slowly came clean, and I cried and cried. Why had no one told me the truth? Gramps dropped me off at Uncle Frank's house, where Frank tried to make light of the situation. In the end, I was happy my real father was near me, instead of in Kenya, a world away. Frank later wrote a poem for me that memorialized the moment. Pop stands, shouts, and asks for a hug. I see my face framed within Pop's black framed glasses. During my formative years, through age 18, I was raised by my real father, Frank Marshall Davis. His frequent lessons in politics mostly involved Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto. He explained, "All history is class struggle between oppressor and oppressed." He lectured that America's corporate system was designed to benefit the rich and keep the poor down. "The wealthy in our era are the new oppressors," he'd say. "People with jobs are oppressed, and the capitalist system must be replaced with socialism." My father liked to brag how he helped the communist-controlled ILWU take over the Democratic Party, then take power in Hawaii, and never give it up. He'd say, "One man, one vote, one time only," and laugh.
I was black, and black I always was. I was bitter, yes.
My father was bitter about black and white. He raged that America was an evil society.
Racism is something that was almost an invention of the United States to serve as a model for the Führer in Germany.
He said the white man held fundamental power over me because of his wealth, that communism was the best way to neuter the white man, take away his money, and therefore his power.
Hitler incidentally sent some emissaries over here to observe in the South.
That's how I learned that racial and class politics were the same.
militantly black. Malcolm X and the Black Panthers.
My father had me read the master of black rage, Malcolm X.
A time when there's got to be a change. People in power have misused it, and now there has to be a change, and a better world has to be built, and the only way it's going to be built is with extreme methods.
I'd tell Gramps I had homework, but I'd really sit in my room reading, book after book, on Malcolm. My world became permanently altered by Frank Marshall Davis as I came to see the world through his eyes. This personal transformation led to an identity crisis. I'd been robbed of my birthright. The African name I was given, Barack Hussein Obama II, wasn't me. Rightfully, I was Frank Marshall Davis, Jr., son of the great communist writer and poet. I told my father I wanted to change my name, but he said, white folks are more accepting of Africans than they are of American Negroes. You'll get a lot further with, my daddy's from Kenya. This was hard to understand. Growing up in multiracial Hawaii and at Punahou School, I'd never experienced racism. Ever. Eventually, I came to embrace the myth.
Frank Marshall Davis was the ideological father of all that would become of my thinking, my plans, and politics. That's all that mattered.
After high school graduation, I enrolled at Occidental College in Los Angeles on a full affirmative action scholarship. I wanted to study with the Marxist professors at what was known as the Moscow of Southern California. My real father approved. He said, I went to college with whites, so I consider myself superior to Negroes reared in Dixie. I arrived at Occidental as a committed revolutionary Marxist. I chose my friends carefully. Maoists, Leninists, Trotskyites, and the Marxist professors. They understood me when I spoke of a coming revolution, where the working class would overthrow the ruling class. I became involved with Students for Economic Democracy. I joined their anti-apartheid marches, put up flyers, and contacted former Black Panthers to speak on campus. But it was all mild-mannered to me. So, after 2 years, and despite poor grades, I transferred to Columbia University in New York City, where I could pursue my growing interest in activism.
For 10 years, they were just a bad memory. But now the Weather Underground and the Black Liberation Army are once again literally blasting their way into the news.
Police booked 2 men and 2 women on charges of armed robbery and the killing of 2 policemen and a Brinks truck guard.
Police found more floor plans of police stations and weapons, as well as a list of policemen targeted for assassination.
Who engaged in detestable acts 40 years ago when I was 8 years old.
The Weather Underground bombing campaign started when I was 8 years old, but it continued well into my 20s.
Another raid turned up plans for a widespread campaign of terrorism in the United States.
The Weathermen's Above Ground Front Group, the May 19th Communist Organization, was based in New York City. They, in turn, operated a host of front groups. May 19 was a revolutionary Marxist organization fighting white imperialism, colonialism, and Zionism. They were handing out flyers at Columbia. It was just what I was looking for. It was a path to earn my birthright as the secret son of Frank Marshall Davis. I attended May 19 meetings, protests, and seminars. I stayed away from the student organizations at Columbia and barely went to class. I became such a Marxist radical. When my sister Maya visited, she thought I was losing it.
8 people have been directly linked by police to the October 20th holdup and murders that has apparently brought together 4 radical groups.
Many of these people I know who are now defendants in the Brinks case. I can't allow them to make me talk about my friends.
When Bernadine Dorn was jailed for refusing to testify about the Brinks robbery, her husband, weatherman Bill Ayers, came to rally support at a May 19 event on Union Street that I attended. Afterwards, I struck up a conversation with Bill. We walked toward his apartment on 123rd Street. It was like meeting the Beatles. The weathermen were not anti-war protesters.
We will build a revolutionary youth movement capable of actively engaging in the war against the imperialists.
They put revolutionary Marxism into practice, something I had only studied in theory.
A bomb went off at the State Department early today, and the Weather Underground claims responsibility.
I'm not committed to nonviolence in any way.
Guard your planes, guard your colleges, guard your banks, guard your children, guard your doors.
I told Bill I'd seen him and Bernadine on TV when they surrendered and left the underground.
Resistance by every means necessary is happening and will continue to happen within the United States as well as around the world, and I remain committed to the struggle ahead.
Bill said his father was Thomas Ayers, the CEO of Commonwealth Edison and one of the most powerful political brokers in Chicago. He said his dad had promised to help Chicago's Attorney General, Richard Daley Jr., become mayor one day if he dropped the riot charges. Federal bombing charges, he said, were dismissed because of illegal wiretaps. Guilty as sin, free as a bird, Bill told me. I wanted to impress Bill, so I told him I joined May 19 because I was a red diaper baby. That my father was Chicago communist Frank Marshall Davis. At first, Bill was shocked. Then he said his dad must have known of my dad from back in Chicago. Bill called his father and put me on the phone with him. That's when Thomas Ayers told me, whenever I needed anything, just to let him know.
This is a guy who lives in my neighborhood, who's a professor of English in Chicago, who I know, and
that was the beginning of my 30-year relationship with Bill Ayers and his family.
Later arrests include Yves Rozan, associated with the May 19th Coalition, the faction of the violence-prone Weather Underground.
Marilyn Buck is one of the links that connect the Weather Underground and the May 19 Coalition.
Bill said May 19 had been taken over by lesbians who were out to prove their manliness by bombing and shooting up everything in sight. And they would all end up in jail. Bill said, I thought we could start a communist revolution by attacking cops.
The device was filled with heavy 1-inch staples. The staple pierced the skull of one policeman.
In San Francisco, Police Sergeant Brian McDonald died today.
Bill said, but my pipe bombs were pipe dreams. It's impossible to overthrow the government from the outside. That's why I'm shifting to academic indoctrination, to overthrow the system from within. So with that advice, I dedicated myself to courses with radical professors at Columbia. I studied political Islam with Edward Said, known as the Professor of Terror because of his relationship with the PLO.
The Israeli view has, I think, had a kind of hegemony, has prevailed to a fantastic degree.
Another professor was Marxist Richard Cloward. He had authored the Crisis Strategy, which advocated overwhelming the welfare rolls with minorities to collapse capitalism. This model of economic sabotage had bankrupted the city of New York in the 70s. I thought it was brilliant. In the spring of 1983, Bill Ayers and I attended the Socialist Scholars Conference at Manhattan's Cooper Union. They emphasized community organizing as a political strategy. They argued the Democratic Party could be turned sharply leftward by polarizing the population along class lines, forcing Democrats to embrace socialism as their natural ideology. Change won't come from the top, they lectured. Change will come from a mobilized grassroots. The strategy was simple. Inflame the lower and working classes against American corporations. I thought it was a skillful adaptation of Marxist principles to modern American realities. After Columbia, Thomas Ayers arranged a community organizing job for me in Chicago with a $25,000 grant from the Woods Fund. Bill said white communists in Chicago were not making inroads in the black community because blacks were religious people, and blacks rejected communism because it was atheist. However, he said, a front man with a black face might win them over. I was elated. My real father, Frank Marshall Davis, had gone from Chicago to Hawaii to organize. Now, I could do the same in reverse. Maybe I could succeed where my father and even Bill had failed.
The weatherman is nothing but child's play, it's folly, and they call it revolution. We think these people may be sincere, but they're misguided, they're muddleheads, and they're scatterbrained.
Arriving in Chicago, I attended Midwest Academy training retreats for organizers. The Midwest Academy was founded by 60s radicals from the SDS.
Are there communists in this organization?
Sure, man. There's a lot of communists. You'll see. We're going to replace capitalism with socialism. We're going to replace capitalism with socialism.
The community organizer job, they explained, was really community agitator. The term organizer was more acceptable. The function of the agitator was to rub salt in the wounds of minorities, stir up their resentment over economic differences, then mobilize that discontent to take power. Blacks were the #1 target, they lectured. Socialists should use them as a weapon, a battering ram, to destroy the capitalist system under the guise of problem solving and fair play.
We're going to be taught how to organize.
The Academy also preached Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals as a blueprint to transform America.
First rule of change is controversy. Change means movement, and movement means friction, and friction means heat.
Alinsky defined the battle cry of change as a code word for socialism and emphasized ruthless tactics for taking power that he'd learned from Al Capone's Chicago Mafia. It was the best education I ever had. In July of 1987, Frank Marshall Davis, my real father, died. I attended his funeral in Hawaii.
Although I move as one disgrace, outlawed by this my land for being black, I may go forth again, fighting, ever fighting.
I was quickly attracted to a substitute father figure, Reverend Jeremiah Wright, Jr. To get close to him, I joined his radical black church and attended his sermons every Sunday.
Anybody who feels white skin is superior to black skin is wrong.
Reverend Wright, my pastor, I think represents the best of what the black church has to offer.
Blacks, whites, Hispanics, Jews, Gentiles.
When Harold Washington died, I set my sights on becoming mayor of Chicago one day. However, Bill Ayers told me elected officials had something I didn't, a law degree, and that Harvard Law was the ticket. I loved the idea, but Harvard acceptance seemed impossible. I had graduated from Columbia without honors in political science, a relatively easy major. Bill said Don Warden, the former Black Panther, could help. He and Bill had hidden out together from the FBI after the Weathermen had bombed the Park Police Station.
They told you that Jesus was white. They told you that the Jews were white.
White American, that's the New World Order. That's why they hate Islam.
Warden, now Khalid al-Mansour, was a radical Islamist and advisor to Saudi billionaire Prince Al-Walid bin Talal, a Harvard donor. He also knew Malcolm X's attorney.
I was introduced to him by a friend who's raising money for him. The friend's name is Dr. Khalid al-Mansour. He told me about Obama, and I wrote a letter in support of him.
I told Reverend Wright I was applying to Harvard so I could run for mayor of Chicago one day. But he said Southside blacks would still consider me to be an outsider because of my white mother and Hawaiian background. He advised, take a roots trip to Africa, to Kenya, just like Malcolm X. When you return, the name Obama will carry an entire story, a history bigger than reality. So I went. The impoverished Kenyan Obamas didn't seem to care that I looked absolutely nothing like them. They were just happy to have an American relative. Amazingly, by some combination of Bill Ayers, Khalid al-Mansour, and maybe more affirmative action, I was accepted into Harvard Law School.
For a lot of kids, the doors that have been open to me aren't open to them.
For years, editors of the prestigious Harvard Law Review were chosen on the basis of grades. However, the position was now subject to race considerations. I saw an opportunity. If I could become the first black president of the Law Review, the publicity might be enough to launch a political career. Even if I never wrote a word. To get elected, I used techniques I'd learned at the Midwest Academy. I just listened to others, never revealing my positions,
and change the standards of what legal writing is about.
They read into me what they wanted, and it worked. Con Edison was the largest client of Chicago law firm Sidley Austin. Thomas Ayers had arranged a job at the firm for Bernadine Dorn, where she worked with Michelle Robinson. They were friends. When Bill's dad got me a summer intern position at Sidley Austin, Bernadine told me Michelle might be a good match. She said Michelle was politically connected. Her father was a Democratic Party precinct captain, and she was friends with Jesse Jackson's kids. She added, "A black woman from the South Side will give you instant street cred." When I met Michelle, we already had a lot in common. She had attended an exclusive prep school and had also gone to the Ivy Leagues, Princeton and Harvard Law, with the help of affirmative action.
I applied to Princeton. Can't go there. Your test scores aren't high enough. I went.
Despite this, Michelle was bitter. She wrote in her Princeton thesis, "Further assimilation into a white cultural and social structure will only allow me to remain on the periphery of society, never becoming a full participant."
I was bitter, yes.
When I married her, a few years later, I married my father. I called her my bitter half. After law school, I returned to Chicago, where Bill and Bernadine were employed in the halls of academia. I began a 20-year partnership with Acorn when I took a job as director of Project Vote, their voter mobilization arm.
Wake it up, 'cause I'm here to tell you about a simple little concept that I shouldn't have to tell you. It's all about voting and the juice it can bring, so get up and get out, 'cause it's a power thing.
I used Black Panther-style posters with the word power and a big X for Malcolm X. I registered 150,000 blacks. I sure wasn't trying to register white folks. Though Project Vote was funded by taxpayers as nonpartisan, it was clear 95% would vote Democrat.
They registered 150,000 voters to get Bill Clinton and Carol Moseley Braun elected.
Just 40% of the registrations were legitimate. I think every cemetery in town voted. We played by our own rules. According to Alinsky, since elections were already a fraud, an instrument of the rich, the ends justified the means. My success with Project Vote earned me the job of training director for Acorn's front groups. For 10 years, I taught Saul Alinsky and class consciousness in Chicago, just like my real father. I was a natural, a master of agitation. I could engage a room full of recruits in rapid-fire socialist dialogue and fire them up.
Are you fired up? Ready to go?
Next, Bill's dad secured a job for me at the Davis Minor Law Firm, which represented the Woods Fund. On behalf of Acorn, I sued the state of Illinois to enforce the motor voter law. This eliminated the requirement for identification and made it easy to register non-existent voters, like Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, even Jive Turkey. Later, 8 of the 19 9/11 hijackers were registered under motor voter.
Change starts when you help a family buy their first home and then help that family stay in that first home.
I also helped Acorn lay the foundation for the subprime mortgage debacle. That's right, I was in on it, on the ground floor.
There's a continuity between the work that I did with Project Vote, the work that I did as an organizer that originally brought me to Chicago, and the work that I'm doing now as an attorney.
We sued Citibank for racial discrimination, forcing them to lower their lending standards. Acorn then found an open door to the White House through HUD Secretary Henry Cisneros, and President Clinton required Fannie and Freddie to approve risky subprime mortgages to unqualified borrowers. The rest is history. Charitable foundation work was a major part of my pre-political career, and Bill Ayers was my partner and close ally. In 1993, Bill appointed me director of the Woods Fund, and in 1995, chairman of the Annenberg Challenge that he co-founded. The money was supposed to be for education. Instead, we funneled it to our radical allies. Next, Vernon Jarrett, a colleague of my real father from the Chicago Star, helped me place Michelle in the mayor's office, where his daughter-in-law, Valerie Jarrett, was working for Mayor Richard Daley. Soon enough, Michelle and Valerie were running an Acorn Front group, Public Allies.
Pregnant with the possibility of tremendous change, we have to go to the root of the problem.
After attending Louis Farrakhan's Million Man March, the book deal I was given as first black president of the Harvard Law Review was canceled. I knew I had a problem. I couldn't write. Even though I was president of a legal journal, I had never published a single article. But Bill said an autobiography would help position me for a run at mayor. So Thomas Ayers secured a new publisher and a $40,000 advance. I gave the money to Bill, along with piles of notes, and he wrote my autobiography. It made sense. Bill had known me since I was 21, had helped me at every step. He knew what to exaggerate, misdirect, or exclude.
I've written 7 books. I've edited another 13.
Right, and also, just you mentioned about the Pentagon and Tom.
I wrote it.
What's that?
I wrote that page.
Yeah, we know. You wrote that?
His father was from Kenya, and his mother was out of Kansas to Hawaii. My guest is Barack Obama. Dreams from my father.
Though I'd never experienced racism in my childhood, Bill invented a string of racial incidents. He said Southside blacks would relate to victimization. Bill bragged, "When I'm done, you'll be just another brother from the hood."
I identify with these young men because they don't have fathers either.
He even changed my teenage identity crisis over my Kenyan name to a crisis of black and white.
My identity was wrapped up with sort of images of freedom riders in the South.
Nor was I ever involved in drugs. But Bill said a history of drug abuse would build street credibility with blacks. So I became the first person in the history of American politics to exaggerate drug use for political gain. Finally, Bill named the book Dreams from My Father and spent 130 pages on my roots trip to Kenya to further obscure my real father's identity. In turn, I endorsed Bill's book, Blaming American Society for Criminal Behavior. In Marxist theory, law is an instrument of the rich to oppress the poor. So breaking the law is an act
We will escalate our attack
of resistance.
The revolutionary movement to begin to fight.
State Senator Alice Palmer, an avowed communist, ran for U.S. Congress and handpicked me for her state Senate seat. Bill and Bernadine launched my political career with a coming out party at their house. However, Alice lost in the primary and ran for her old seat again. I knew from Project Vote that most voter registrations on the South Side were fraudulent. So, I challenged the signatures, and Alice was disqualified. Though I ran as a Democrat, I was a member of Acorn's Socialist Party, the New Party, and they were thrilled with my victory.
Our firm was not the attorneys primarily for Tony Rezko, but were attorneys for the non-for-profit group.
To comprehend my relationship with Tony Rezko, you need to understand what we call the Chicago Way. It involves access to power, government jobs, and federal money. Politicians reward law firms and real estate developers with contracts. In return, they pay for the politicians' re-election campaigns. In other words, the C in Chicago stands for corruption. At Davis Minor, I represented Syrian-born Tony Rezko, a major client.
Mr. Rezko, he's somebody who raised money for my campaign during the course of 10 years. My 2 state senate races, a congressional race, as well as a United States Senate race.
Tony Rezko bankrolled my political campaigns and helped me buy a 6,000 square foot Georgian mansion in Hyde Park.
And what is true is that I also purchased a piece of land from him. Everything was above board, and there's been no allegations that there wasn't.
In return, I helped Rezko get a $100 million grant for his redevelopment schemes. Rezko simply kept the money and abandoned the low-income properties. That's right, Tony funded my campaigns and subsidized my house, and I lobbied the state to get taxpayer money for Tony. That's the Chicago way. My record in the state Senate mostly involved social welfare legislation and race-based measures. I put Reverend Wright on my advisory committee, and I worked closely with Acorn's network of front groups, as well as Farrakhan's Nation of Islam. I voted present 129 times to avoid political liability. My friends in the state Senate were white liberals. We played golf and poker. State Senator Don Trotter called me a white man in blackface. While planning to run for mayor, I stumbled onto a larger stage.
I will be a candidate for the United States Senate in 2004.
It happened when Bill's dad introduced me to Axe, David Axelrod, a lobbyist for Commonwealth Edison. Axe was also a red diaper baby. Like my real father, his mother was a red journalist.
As a community organizer, gives me...
However, I was looking more like Frank Marshall Davis as I got older. If my real father's identity was discovered, my true political foundations would be revealed. So, just before the campaign, I had a rhinoplasty. That's right, a nose job. In order to get black support, I put on my black preacher voice.
I believe that we can provide homes to the homeless. Y'all having fun?
As luck would have it, I was chosen as keynote speaker for the 2004 Democratic Convention. I presented my personal story as the multicultural ideal.
My father was a foreign student, born and raised in a small village in Kenya. He grew up herding goats.
I closed by quoting my pastor.
The audacity of hope.
In my short time in the U.S. Senate, I sponsored a bill to send federal money to Acorn and another to name a post office. I also requested a $1 million earmark for the Chicago hospital that had created a $300,000 job for Michelle. It was the Chicago way. After only 5 months as senator, I formed a committee to run for president. David Axelrod called it the plan. However, when Axe reviewed my resume, he saw too many red flags. No pun intended. He said, while being a Marxist is a virtue in Chicago, your radical views have to be hidden from voters on the national stage. Axe suggested my personal life story as the campaign theme. The missing African father, a goat herder who came to the U.S. for a Harvard education, a wandering mother, nurturing white grandparents. You, he opined, are above the fray that divides liberals and conservatives because of your background. To emphasize the campaign theme, Axe arranged another roots trip to Kenya. I allied myself with Odinga Odinga and his Marxist Kenyan People's Union, who were allied with the Islamists. Marxists and Islamists have much in common. We both consider American capitalism as an enemy that must be destroyed. Returning from Kenya, I suggested the catchphrase, hope and change. Change was Alinsky's code word for socialist revolution. And hope was from Jeremiah Wright's Audacity of Hope sermon. Axe loved it. Just don't give any specifics, and people will fill in what they want, he said. For the campaign slogan, we used, yes, we can, translating, si se puede, from Cesar Chavez's migrant workers' strikes. Axe said leftists are attracted to the cult of personality. So, he had a campaign poster designed similar to Marxist cult heroes Lenin and Che Guevara. When I was in May 19, I had read all the Weather Underground literature, and I loved their logos.
The strongest logos tell simple stories that the leaders of an organization are comfortable telling.
And if one voice can change a room, it can change a city. And if it can change a city, it can change a state. And if it can change a state, it can change a nation.
Written by my head speechwriter, my new book, The Audacity of Hope, was the campaign rollout. Along with Dreams from My Father, the Obama is a genius myth was created.
In a way, Obama's standing above the country, above the world. He's sort of God.
The genius myth is why I refused to release my high school, college, and university transcripts. God does not have a C average. If the public knew a C student had advanced through affirmative action and dubious connections, then I would beat no one special, just another Chicago politician swimming in a cesspool of corruption.
Sending a powerful message that change is coming to America. Change does not happen from the top down, it happens from the bottom up.
In stump speeches, I carried my message of change.
The American people will embrace the change, and our time for change has come.
The crowds cheered, even though they had no idea what I was talking about.
Hope! Hope!
Hope used to be free, but now you had to pay me with your vote to get it.
Not content to settle for the world as it is, who have the courage to remake the world as it should be.
I acquired my oratory skills from listening to my father read poetry.
At school, I honed my mind against sleek sides of white ideas.
He had impeccable timing. skillfully raising and lowering his voice to impact the listener. I delivered speeches via the teleprompter. Without it, I was lost. I would stammer with uncomfortable pauses and unfortunate misstatements.
If you gave them treatment early, and they got some treatment and a breathalyzer or an inhalator.
Talked about my Muslim faith, and you're absolutely right that has not
Christian
come
faith.
My Christian faith.
During the debates with Hillary, as I glanced at her, I knew the socialist revolution would succeed. She was one of us. Hillary was a disciple of Saul Alinsky, the subject of her senior thesis. And it was Hillary who ordered then Deputy Attorney General Eric Holder to pardon Susan Rosenberg and Linda Evans, convicted in the Brinks robbery and May 19 related violence.
You know, as a black man, you know, Barack can get shot going to the gas station.
During the campaign, my bitter half was on the trail with me.
And let me tell you something, for the first time in my adult life, I am proud of my country.
Michelle had taken advanced training in crowd manipulation at the Midwest Academy. It went like this. Tell them their lives are impossible.
This veil of impossibility. You can't pay for rent, mortgage, food, put gas in your car. This veil of impossibility. And we're living in a society where childcare is unaffordable, it's not accessible.
Tear down their egos a little.
We have to fix our souls. Our souls are broken in this nation.
Then dangle a carrot of hope.
There's only one person who on that day will snatch that veil of impossibility off of the heads of millions of little kids. I am married to the answer.
In Marxist theory, there are immovable barriers that prevent people from increasing their wealth.
Believing that their hard work will lead to some reward, some payoff. But what they find is that they get there and then the bar has changed.
If a person can improve themselves, there is no justification for radical change.
They shifted to the left and to the right. It's always just quite out of reach. They moved the bar. So you have to work even harder. And it's not fair, it's not right.
Therefore, the middle class must feel frustrated and lost, fearful, without a future.
Seems that we've grown to be a nation that is afraid of everyone and everything. When you are afraid of everyone and everything, it's hard to see past that fear. They want you to be afraid of change.
You see, we Marxists compare America to a socialist utopia, not to the rest of the world.
There are kids who still believe in the American dream, in the beauty and fairness of our democracy. They think it exists.
So for us,
and don't get sick in this country, not here.
America,
and things have gotten progressively worse throughout my lifetime,
is hell.
I could go on and on and on.
Axe had worked at the Chicago Tribune for years. He said the media would accept anything I said at face value because, by and large, they were socialists themselves. MSNBC became Obama Vision.
Well, to reach back to one of our heroes from the past, from the 60s, Saul Alinsky once said,
he's a friend and a great leader. Give an extraordinary welcome to my pastor, Dr. Jeremiah A. Wright Jr.
The government gives them the drugs, builds bigger prisons, passes a 3-strike law, and then wants us to sing God Bless America? No, no, no. Not God Bless America. God damn America.
This is somebody who I have known for 17 years. You know, he and I have a relationship. He is like an uncle.
That's in the Bible for killing innocent people. God damn America!
Reverend Wright's condemnation of America was the rule, not the exception. Many left his church because of it, but not me. When video clips of Reverend Wright surfaced, I denied I was even there, with a straight face.
I did not hear such incendiary language myself personally, either in conversations with him or when I was in the pew.
And they will not only attack you if you try to point out what's going on in white America, U.S. of KKKA.
I mean, I think I read in your book that you used to listen to tapes of Reverend Wright when you were at Harvard Law School.
I did.
So you had no idea.
I did not.
Axe told me to keep my Marxist mouth shut on the campaign trail, but at times I couldn't help myself.
We cannot continue to rely only on our military in order to achieve the national security objectives that we've set. We've got to have a civilian national security force that's just as powerful.
I'm getting ready to buy a company.
Yeah.
Your new tax plan is going to tax me more, isn't it?
It's not that I want to punish your success. I think when you spread the wealth around, it's good for everybody.
In Pennsylvania, like a lot of small towns in the Midwest, they get better and they cling to guns or religion or antipathy towards people who aren't like them.
We are 5 days away from fundamentally transforming the United States of America. In this election, at this defining moment, change has come to America.
The white middle class bought my story. The son of a Kenyan goat herder who is above politics. And I became America's first affirmative action president. My real father was right. Frank Marshall Davis Jr. could not have won. But Barack Hussein Obama II could lead America to socialism.
This victory alone is not the change we seek. It is only the chance for us to make that change.
It was a great achievement for Bill Ayers, too. He and his father had nurtured my career for 27 years.
Bill and I were in Grant Park. The 60s were a springboard for this election and changing direction of this country.
We need a revolution in this country.
We can do it in stages, doesn't have to be all at once.
Yes, we can.
I immediately took steps to replace American capitalism with socialism.
Real and lasting change for generations to come.
I didn't announce any ideological plan, just problem solving. First up, I signed the stimulus bill, written by the Apollo Alliance.
2 other members of the Weather Underground were charged with possession of explosives. Jeffrey Jones and Eleanor Raskin were picked up in a raid that followed the Brinks robbery.
To me and my comrades, the federal government was just a large foundation for funneling money to our socialist front groups. In the Marxist model, government control of the economy is essential. That's why a takeover of General Motors was a dream of my real father.
The insurance companies are going to have to abide by some basic rules of the road that exemplify a sense of fairness.
National health care is a socialist tool to eliminate the classes. That's why poor quality, long waits, and higher taxes don't matter.
The American people are seeing massive government intrusion in almost every area of their lives. Government take over banks, taking over auto companies, their health insurance. And they see these czar positions being handed out like candy suckers.
No more secrecy. That's a commitment I make to you as president.
Next, I centralized power with me.
Because of the critical importance of this work, I will personally select this official.
The cabinet was just a smokescreen to obscure my czars, the shady characters who answered only to me.
No, we're going to change the whole system. We're going to change the whole thing.
And this official will have my full support and regular access to me.
Not to Congress or the American people.
Czars are usually Russian, imperialists, not Democrats.
I told Eric Holder to ignore the laws I didn't like or go around them, like the DREAM Act and the Defense of Marriage Law.
Already, this oil spill is the worst environmental disaster America has ever faced.
I used the BP pipeline break in the Gulf to redistribute wealth.
We will make BP pay for the damage their company has caused.
To nationalize energy, I used green jobs and cap and trade. And I vetoed the Keystone Oil pipeline from Canada. According to my father, America was not an honorable and generous nation that had rallied to defend freedom.
There have been times where America's shown arrogance and been dismissive, even derisive.
America was an arrogant, imperialist oppressor that controlled the world, and we owed them an apology.
We've at times been disengaged, and at times we've sought to dictate our terms.
Adjusting how the United States thinks of itself in the world. That's, to me, an enormous thing.
With a father from Kenya, a mother from Kansas, and a story that...
Of course, I could not release my real birth certificate. With father unknown, the entire foundation of my political career, the Kenyan father fairy tale, would be revealed as a fraud. Investigators would uncover the identity of my real father, Frank Marshall Davis, and connect the Marxist dots of my life history and politics. The birthers were on a fool's errand. They were asking the wrong question. Instead of, where's the birth certificate? They should have been asking, who's the real father?
But Osawatomie, this is not just another political debate.
I opened my re-election campaign with an attack on capitalism in Osawatomie, Kansas, home of the Weather Underground newspaper of the same name.
Those at the very top grew wealthier from their incomes and their investments, but everybody else struggled. That is the height of unfairness.
Take it then from the carelessness of the money drunk.
Now this kind of inequality we haven't seen since the Great Depression.
Place it in the reaching hands of the little people.
There are millions of working families in this country who are now forced to take their children to food banks for a decent meal. The free market, it doesn't work. It has never worked. It's also why a recent study showed that countries with less inequality tend to have stronger and steadier economic growth over the long run. This isn't about class warfare.
My re-election strategy is to polarize the nation across class lines.
We can either settle for a country where a shrinking number of people do really well.
Tightening tentacles of the reaching corporations.
Or we can build a nation where everybody gets a fair shot and everybody plays by the same rules.
This is Ron Jones, a Philadelphia area voter. Ron, what are people saying about the excitement of voting in this particular election?
It's time for change, man. I decided to come back and vote a couple times.
I think that's against the law, but it's okay.
We're recruiting and training Latino organizers. We're holding Latino voter registration drives across America.
In my next term, like my real father, I will support turning millions of illegal aliens into U.S. citizens.
And together, we are not just going to win this election, we will transform this nation. Si se puede.
Working class whites might not go along again with my plans so easily. As Abraham Lincoln said, you can't fool all of the people all of the time. So I'm relying on a minority coalition to win re-election. Those receiving free government handouts, racial voting blocs, government workers, union members, and white liberals.
This month, we're announcing the 2012 launch of African Americans for Obama.
Because I won't have to worry about putting gas in my car. I won't have to worry about paying my mortgage. If I help him, he's going to help me.
Obama needs us, Acorn, but we need Obama, don't we?
With increased funding for Acorn's network, I will make sure that America finances a war against itself.
We're going to do over 2 million voters.
These foot soldiers can never be stopped.
Acorn united will never be defeated. Acorn unidos jamás serán vencidos.
If one front group is shut down, its members will just slither over to another one. And like my real father, I'll blame Congress to get more support.
My father was a foreign student, born and raised in a small village in Kenya. He grew up herding goats.
I bamboozled gullible, middle-class America with a laughable illusion that I was the son of a Kenyan goat herder who stood above politics. They bought into silly, meaningless slogans like hope and change and yes, we can. My smile was the Trojan horse, unleashing a deadly Marxist agenda upon the middle class. Where my friends and I transfer wealth from successful businesses to failing union enterprises, and taxpayer money is given to irresponsible individuals.
The big banks should increase access to refinancing opportunities to borrowers who haven't yet benefited from historically low interest rates. This is a make or break moment for the middle class and for all those who are fighting to get into the middle class.
To us, the middle class are merely pawns. Socialist economies don't have a middle class. Heavily taxed, the middle class's health care will be given away to the poor and illegals. Their employers will be taxed and regulated out of business. Middle America's retirement will evaporate into a bankrupt socialist state. And the middle class will disappear. America will have just one lower class. Political elites will run the government and control the wealth. And America will be irreversibly socialist without ever realizing how it happened. These are my dreams, the dreams from my real father.